Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to go over how I sequence my Eurorack setup using the Teenage Engineering OPZ and its Oplab module, complete with instructions on how to get step components working as well. Now I'm not really good at editing video yet, so you can bet this is going to be a long one. I'll just put some timestamps down here on the side in case you know what you're doing, and if not, we'll just get right into it. See you in. So, here is the OPZ in all of its glory. Great sequencer, great synth, and here's the Oplab module. This guy is going to allow us to interface our OPZ with different kinds of equipment, including Eurorack stuff, other pocket operators, and MIDI. Comes with a MIDI cable, and that's the module right there. So the first thing we need to do is open the back. When I first did this, I thought that I would need a special kind of screwdriver to open these, but it turns out you can just turn them with your hand. No screwdriver needed. They only need a 90-degree turn counterclockwise to loosen them up. And although you can't see it on the camera, there are very small, almost like dimples on the screws, so you can see whether they're locked in or not. So we remove the top carefully after disengaging all the locks. This is the open back of the OPZ, and this thing here is the dummy module, and that's where our Oplab module will go. This is the battery. Let's get this guy out. You can just unclip it like that. Needs a bit of force, but it's alright. This dummy module can actually turn into a phone holder. You can actually snap these bits on the inside off. Anyway, moving on. So, this is the module itself. To install, what we're going to do is we're going to put it in this way, this side first, get those lined up with those holes, and slot that in. First thing, very important, this tab right at the bottom of the Oplab is kind of like the lock and the on and off switch for it. So when we first put it in, we want to make sure it's pushed all the way up. And we can insert that, pop that in, and then pull it down to lock it into place. So now, let's replace this. Again, we can use the handy little feet we broke off of that fake module to pop that back in. Like so. And that's now secure. And we're ready to use the Oplab module. Hey guys, it's me from the future here. Just want to point out the different functionality there is on the Oplab module. As you can see, there are little flick toggly switches here under out and in. So those are MIDI, trig, and PO for out, and MIDI and trig for in. And it's kind of self-explanatory what they do. So for out, MIDI will output MIDI on the module track, trig will output triggers, so this is stuff for Eurorack and everything like that, and PO will output the pocket operator sync like click, so you can clock and synchronize your pocket operators. For the in track, if you flick that to MIDI, that's obviously just gonna receive MIDI in, and for trig, it will receive trig in for things like clocks. So I would probably say I'm gonna focus this video on the trig output there, because that's what we're going to use to trigger and sequence our Eurorack. Cool. So now that we've installed our module, let's go through the basics and test it in the context of syncing this to a modular system. The first thing we can do is go to the module track. Track 14 on the OPZ is the module track. So if we just select that, we're now on the module track, and if I press these buttons here on the keyboard, we can see that on the top one of our ports is lighting up. Actually, two are lighting up, but one is really much more dim than the other. So this port here, where my thumb is, that's our gate output. And the one on the left, which is actually lighting up, though it's hard to see, it's not as bright, that's our pitch CV. So as I play the different notes here, you can see the gate light goes on. As the gate is, well, high, the pitch CV also comes out. So one thing about the Oplab module is that it actually supports stereo cables. So this is a mono cable. This is what would be typically used for a Eurorack. Notice that there's only the one black ring here. And this is kind of what a stereo cable looks like. Notice that there are two black rings. You can use mono cables, but you get more control voltages to play around with if you use a stereo cable. And here's what I mean. This part here, the gate jack, that's outputting gate. And if you use a mono cable, the gate is exactly what you get. But if you were to use a stereo cable plugged into that jack, you would get gate on one channel of the stereo, and on the other channel you actually get control voltage, which you can control with the blue encoder. Similarly, with this one all the way on the left, this is the pitch CV jack. If you use a mono cable, you get pitch CV out, no problem. If you use a stereo cable, you can also use the green encoder to control another control voltage. I'm not going to be talking about CV2 and CV3 in this video, mainly because I think they're quite self-explanatory, and also because I actually don't have a stereo splitter to split out the two control voltages. So yeah, embarrassingly enough, we'll be sticking with mono and just looking at CV and gate. That's CV1 and the gate output, and how we can use this to interface with our Eurorack. We've already covered the module track. I'm just going to use the No Coast here as my sort of guinea pig synth, right? Just to show you how it all works, I'm going to patch the gate out here into the gate trigger here on No Coast contour circuit, which is basically normal to be the envelope generator for the whole thing. I'm going to patch the pitch CV, again with the mono cable, into the volt per octave. And so when I play here, we can control the No Coast. And the module track, it does work fairly differently from other tracks, but there are still some familiar things you can do. So much like other tracks, I could put steps in, right? And I can also change the pitch of those steps. It works similarly to the other tracks in how you can punch in notes, record notes on the fly, and and just play things just like that. One thing you might be wondering is, how do I use step components with this? Because the OPZ is an incredibly powerful sequencer, and that's mainly due to its step components. We're on the module track now. If you hold down shift and try and place a step component like you would in any of the other 8 playing tracks, you'll find that it doesn't work the same way. So if I hold down shift now, this isn't the step component settings. This is actually MIDI settings. When you're on the module track and you hold down shift, all these are just your MIDI settings. You can't play step components on this track. And I'll get to how we can use step components in this sort of setup in a second. It's kind of a workaround, but it's kind of exciting to show as well. But before that, I'm going to go through just one more way in which we can use the OPZ to trigger external gear, in this case the No Coast. The other way we can use this OPZ to trigger external gear is by using a jump step component. Basically, we can go to any one of these 8 tracks. I'm just going to go to the bass drum track. Punch in a really bad rhythm. Right? So what we can do is, and I'll disconnect these first because it will work through different jacks. And this is mainly just for triggers. This one doesn't send note CV, at least not yet. Let's say I want to trigger my No Coast or whatever synth on this step. What I can do is hold down shift, select the step, select the jump step component, and then set a value of 0. So I'll just go through that again. We hold down shift and we press the step we want the trigger to happen on. And then we look for this step component here that looks like headphones or a musical tie. And then we press the value of 0. So what this means is, and I'll show you, when I play this and the OPZ goes over the step that we've added the jump step component to, you're going to see it send a trigger out. So it's playing now, and it is very hard to see, but on that one step that we added the component to, we're actually getting a trigger out of this jack, which is the output jack. So remember, in case you're confused, and it is confusing, we installed the OPZ Oplab module this way, and it was out in trig CV, I think? Yeah, out in trig CV. But when we play with it, we're playing with it this way. So it goes out in trig CV. Because we set the out to trig, if you remember, I left that toggle in the middle. That's now sending out our trig. And you can see it trigger with light, which means we can patch that to a trigger. So now the no coast is only triggering on that one step we added the jump step component to. So the thing you might be wondering is, can I then use step components here, like with this jump step component? So we know that this step has the trigger step. So could we add another step component on top of that? Well, let's try. The easiest way to see if it works is to also add the multiplier step component on top, which would play the sound twice, or so we expect. But it doesn't work. The step components don't work very well out of the box. But now let's go through how we can get around that. There's a very neat little trick we can do with the MIDI channels, where we can send MIDI from one track into another. So what we'll be basically doing is sending MIDI from one of these tracks that we can choose, can be any track, into the module track. And that way we can harness both the trigger, the CV for a pitch and things like that, as well as the step components. So I'll show you how to do that now. It needs a bit of computer work though, so just be ready for that. The very first thing you want to do is put your OPZ into content mode. So you do this by holding down the track button and turning it on. And if you did it right, all these lights in the track will be green and you'll know that you're in content mode. Now, connect it to your computer via the USB-C cable, and it's going to show up as a removable disk on your computer. So now we'll take it into the computer to see what we need to do. So now that our OPZ is connected and in content mode, we should be able to see it as a removable drive in our computer, which we can just open up. And we're going to look for the config folder, and inside there we're going to look for the MIDI.json file. And we can open that, and it's going to look something like this on the inside. And what we're interested in is this line, the track channels. So what the track channels are, it's basically which track is sending MIDI to which track, essentially, at least for the purposes we're interested in. So this array here, okay, this list of numbers, there are 16 numbers inside, and these correspond to the 16 tracks on the OPZ. So 0 is the bass drum track, 1 would be the snare drum, 2 is the hi-hat, and so on. So it starts at 0, arrays start at 0, so despite there being 16 tracks, the numbers go from 0 to 15. Our module track is module number 13. So what we want to do for this hack and to get our step components working is to choose any one track between 0 and 7, which are the first 8 playable tracks, and we want to change one of them to point basically to the module track, which we know is 13. So right now, each one of these tracks, they're basically sending MIDI out on themselves. So bass drum track, which is the first element of this list, is sending to track 0. Snare, which is the second element, setting to track 1. What we're going to do, you can pick any one of the tracks from 0 to 7. I'm going to pick the bass drum track. You want to change that 0 or whichever number you pick to 13. So now that track is going to send its MIDI to the module track, and that's going to go out of our module. Pick whichever one you like and then set it to send to channel 13. Then just save the document and safely eject your OPZ from your computer. And that's the computer part done. So now once you're done with all of that and you've ejected your OPZ, it should reboot and turn on once the eject is complete. And now we can start taking advantage of those step components. Cool. So what is the difference now? Now that we've routed, in my case, I've routed MIDI from this drum channel, kick drum channel, into the module channel. So what does that do for us? Well, let's clear out the drum channel right now. So as you can see, the drum channel is completely clear. The module channel is also completely clear. So there's absolutely nothing happening. Okay, no sound from the OPZ, no triggers coming out from any of the jacks, no CV coming out either. Let's try and put in some steps now. Right now, this sequence is playing. We haven't added any jump step components. So by right, if everything was the same as before, we wouldn't be getting any triggers out. But take a look now. See that? Now, this jack is outputting whatever's been played here. Like these notes that I've sequenced in are now individual triggers. And though it's hard to see, the control voltage track, or the control voltage jack rather, to its left is also outputting control voltage. So let me show you now what the difference is. Remember, we haven't added in any step components to, actually send triggers out. This is all just coming from the track. So let's patch that gate into here. And let's patch the CV into 1 volt per octave. Cool. This is kind of like what we've had earlier. A bit less fiddly now, maybe. We can change notes too. Nice. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for. What about step components? They didn't work last time. Let's try now. So I'm going to go shift. I'm going to hit a step. I'm just going to do the mult, and I'm going to make it play 8 times. Let's see if it works. Okay, 8 is probably quite a bit, so I'm going to turn that down to 4. And this works with most other step components, so if I were to pick this one and maybe do this trig step component so it only plays every second time. So we've basically found a way to use step components with the Oplab. Now there is of course a trade-off, which is the fact that right now it's playing in tandem with the kick drum, and we can hear that, right? We can hear the kick drum as well as the no coast. So at the end of the day, if you only want to hear your synthesizer or whatever you're connecting it to, you're just gonna have to mute the track that you're using. Mute it and mute the effect sends as well. So if we had muted that, we wouldn't be able to hear any drums or any effects from the drums, and we would just be able to sequence our Eurorack in peace and in silence just by itself, which is pretty cool. So let's go through a really quick jam breakdown. Now you've been hearing this little tune playing in between sections of this video and probably in the beginning somewhere in the background. I'm just going to take one pattern from that whole jam and then show you how I use the OPZ to interface with my Eurorack to make the jam. So this is the pattern I'm choosing. So this pattern is made up of 3 main components. We have, of course, the drums, we got the chords that are playing, and we have this little drone in the back that goes like do 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 do, right? So we'll go through each one by one and how I use the OPZ to sequence the Eurorack to make almost all the sounds. So we'll go through the chords first because it's the simplest. The chords are just programmed on the OPZ itself. It has no interface with the Eurorack whatsoever. All the chord sounds are just coming from the OPZ. So that one's simple, that one's done. Now for the actual Eurorack part. As you can recall, I set the bass drum track to be the one that sends to my module track. So that's where all the magic is happening right now. For the bass drum track right now, I'm using it to sequence the Eurorack. More specifically, I'm using it to sequence Plats in its physical modeling mode. Right here, of course, we have the trig out and the CV. This CV is going into the model for Plats. Of course, in order to tune it properly, it's going into maths first, and I'm using the attenuverter on maths to make sure that across these keys I can play different notes. I can choose different models from Plats. So down here, I can play these sounds, and then up here, I can play different sounds. And then of course you can move over octaves and stuff to get different sounds. So cool. So that's how the drums are being sequenced on Plats, right? So all these steps that I've selected, they're all sending triggers out, and then each of these red trigs, each of these steps rather, I've programmed specific notes into them on the OPZ so that they get the right control voltage into the Plats model, and we can get different hi-hats and stuff. And that's how you get the different drum hits from Plats. Earlier I mentioned that if you wanted to sequence the Eurorack in silence, you would have to mute this track and also mute the effect sends. But what I've done is I've left it just unmuted, and so that way the bass drum is playing in tandem with all of the other trigs that I've sequenced. Okay, so if I turn down the volume responsible for sound from the OPZ, we'll see that there's no kick drum and we've lost a bit of bass in our kicks. So by leaving in and not muting the kick drum on the OPZ, I can help it double up my kicks. So the kicks and all the percussion gets a bit more punch. So that's how the drums are done. Next up, let's go over the drone. So I'm just gonna mute everything else and show you guys what the drone sounds like by itself. Of course, it's a lot quieter in the actual jam, but I've taken advantage of the jump step component within the bass drum track so that I can output gate and CV from the regular playing of the OPZ, but I can also use those jump step components we've talked about to trigger something else. So if I hold shift and we look at the steps, right, they've all lit up green. So what I've actually done is for every single step in this bass drum pattern, I've added a step component. So even these blank ones with no step put in, if we look, I've actually put in the jump step component, and that's going to 0. And I've done that for all the steps. So every single step along this sequence, regardless of whether it's playing anything on the track or not, is going to send a trig out through this. And this is going up and it's triggering rings. It's making rings do a pluck for every single step. I've also multed it and put it into a clock divider and then put that through math so I could modulate the pitch, which is why it goes do 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 do, right? So that's how that works, that drone. And then just to take it back to the drums, I've used step components for those too. So if we just listen to that, if I just take out the drone. So you can, if you listen, you can hear that I've actually used step components there, not just for triggering rings with every step like I've said. So if we inspect some of these ones at the end, you can see for this step here, of course the jump step component is there to trigger rings, like I've mentioned, but I've also used this trigger component, I believe, I forget what it's called, so that it only triggers every second time it's being played. And then similarly to here, it's the same one, that step for example. And then this last one, I've got that same trigger step component every fourth time it would play. And I've also got it melting to play 4 times. Let me just, yep. So as you can see, I'm able to sequence the Eurorack, I'm able to use step components when sequencing it, and I'm also using the jump step component, so I get one extra way to send triggers out. And that's it for the video, guys. I hope you learned something. I hope you took something useful away from this video. It is the first time I've tried to record, edit, and put everything together, so do let me know if you have any constructive feedback in the comments. You know, drop a like if you liked the video, and I'll see you guys next time.